Hi, I'm Heidi from Garden Crossings, and in today's video we're going to go through and trim various perennials in the garden. I often get asked, especially this time of year, how do you trim your perennials? How far do you cut them back? When do you cut them back? So we're just going to go through the garden and trim maybe 10 or so perennials that are out here. So you'll want to make sure that you watch to the end to see if we talk about one of the perennials that you may have questions on. It's really quite easy, and I think a lot of people are more worried about how and when to trim the perennials than really what it needs to be. So let's go ahead and start trimming. The first plant we're going to look at is milkweed, also known as Asclepias. So right now this Asclepias or milkweed is starting to go into seed. So what I'm going to do is, before we go ahead and trim this plant, I personally want to go in and try to collect as much seed as I can. So you can see these buds here, they've already kind of started to go to seed and they're starting to blow away on their own, and they're very fuzzy, and those are going to be really hard to collect seed on because they've already cracked open. But this one here that I just pulled off, this is in its prime. You can see how the seed pod is just nicely cracked open, how the seeds are nestled just perfectly inside. And this is where it really is easy. You just take it in your hand like this, pull the fuzzies, let them go, and you end up with a whole handful of seeds that can then be planted in your garden next year so that you can have more milkweed. Now, why is milkweed important in the garden? Well, milkweed is the only host plant for the monarch butterfly. So if you're looking to attract monarch butterflies to your garden, it's important that you have milkweed or Asclepias in the garden. There's a lot of different varieties of milkweed out there, and really they're not picky as to what type of milkweed you have. It just has to be milkweed in general. So I'm going to go ahead, and you can see I've got this nice handful here of seeds. We're going to let them dry, and then I'll put them in a container, and then we'll keep them for next year. So there are a few buds on here yet that are still pretty fresh. So this one hasn't cracked open, but as you can see, there's like a nice little split in it. So again, we're gonna just go through, pull the seeds off, and then we'll have them ready to dry. So I'm gonna just snip this tip off. Actually, I'm gonna grab my scissors a minute and make things easier. So I'm just gonna cut this off, take it inside with me so that I can collect the seeds. But now that I have all of the buds that we can still harvest from off, I'm gonna show you how to cut back this milkweed. So grab your favorite trimming device. It might be a pruner. I like to use scissors, whatever it is. Grab your favorite thing to cut with. So we're gonna go ahead and just here near the base, we're gonna cut them back. That was pretty easy to do. This one's a little thicker, so this one maybe a pruner would be better. There we go. So that is how to trim back your milkweed. Gather the seeds and trim them near the base. The next plant on the chopping block, just kidding. The next plant we're going to trim is Amsonia storm cloud. So this is a spring blooming perennial, beautiful periwinkle blue blooms, usually in May or so. The nice thing with storm cloud too is as it emerges out of the ground, the twigs that come out are dark black. So not only does it have beautiful flowers, it has beautiful twigs and foliage as well. So let's go in and trim this one back. So I'm just kind of grabbing a handful here and about 3 or so inches off the ground and trimming it back. Oh, there's a weed. So we'll let you go in and see kind of what it was and what it is now. So we'll go ahead and keep trimming it all back so that it's about 3 or so inches off the ground. One thing with Amsonia, a lot like the milkweed, is that it's kind of juicy. So you can see how it's kind of got some sticky substance coming out of it. So just be careful that when you're trimming that you don't get that on your hands and rub your eyes, because that would create a lot of pain in the eyes. So let's go ahead and keep trimming. There we go. And that is what Amsonia storm cloud looks like when it is done being trimmed back. Another spring blooming favorite is Baptisia, also known as false indigo. So Baptisia usually blooms for us here in West Michigan, usually in the month of May. There's a lot of different color of Baptisia. There's reds and yellows and purples and almost chocolatey brown coloration. So many beautiful blooms, so much. Just it's a welcome sign to spring when these Baptisia are blooming. When they're done blooming though, they leave you with a very just kind of a nice shrub looking habit. They're not a shrub at all, but the foliage that's left behind really almost seems like it could be a shrub in the garden. Also, it does have some really nice seed pods. Some people will choose to leave the seed pods on for the summer. Other people will cut them off, but this is what the seeds look like of Baptisia. You can see them there. So some people will leave them, some people will get rid of them. We just kind of let them be and let them do their thing. Usually they're not going to reseed here, so it's not a big deal if the seeds do drop. So we go from this very nice, tall, 3 to 4 foot size shrub looking perennial, and we're going to trim this back as well down to about 2 or 3 inches. So let's go ahead and get this Baptisia trimmed down. Now I should have brought a pruners out with me because these are a little bit tougher to cut. And of course, why would I want to run in and grab one when I, have this? So we'll just go ahead and trim them back to about 2 to 3 inches, one stem at a time. Let's remove some of this. You can maybe hear the seeds rattling. So that's what it's looking like so far. And we're going to go ahead and continue to trim it until it's all gone. There we go. And that is what your Baptisia should look like when you are done pruning it. Now that it's late in fall, I'm sure all of your tall phlox are done flowering, as are ours. So this one here is Phlox David. And I'm going to go ahead and trim this one back too to kind of 2 or 3 inches. You can kind of see there's a theme here with how far I trim. 2 to 3 inches is kind of my standard go-to amount. So let's go ahead and get this phlox trimmed back. There we go. Tall phlox trimming completed. So before we continue and go much further into this video, I do need to put a little disclaimer. And that disclaimer is, we here at Garden Crossings trim almost all of our plants in the fall. And the reason is because the fall is when we have time to do it. In the spring, we are busy shipping out your orders and really don't have a ton of time to get out into the garden. So we don't have time to do our trimming in the spring. So most all trimming happens here in the fall. So for you, you may personally choose to trim your plants in the spring, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, basically, how far I'm trimming them back can be done in the fall or can be done in the spring, whichever works best for you and your schedule. So I always feel like if I don't say that, somebody's gonna say, but Heidi, you shouldn't be trimming in the fall. The answer is, for Heidi, yes, I do need to be trimming in the fall because we have time right now to do it. So don't let trimming be a stressful thing for you. I know a lot of people are very like, this is when things need to be done. Oh, you can't do it any other time. Don't let gardening be stressful. Please don't let gardening be stressful. It's supposed to be an enjoyable thing to do, and when you have time to get out there and do it, that's the best time to do it, is when you have time. That being said, the next plant I'm going to be trimming is Hastas. Now, it's not necessarily time yet to trim the Hastas, but I do not like trimming my Hastas when they get all slimy and gross after they've been hit by a frost. I would much rather trim them now while they're still fairly fresh and not disgusting to touch. Please tell me there's someone out there that is in total agreement with what I'm about to do. I know there is, because some of you have said slimy hostas are gross. So I'm going to go ahead and take this hosta love story, which still is looking good, but the first frost we get, what could happen any day now, is going to turn it mushy and gross. So how far down do I cut the hostas? Let's take a closer look. So what I do with the hostas is, if I can get my hand around them, I'll do that, is I'll just take them, grab them like so, and start trimming. So I trimmed all the leaves off, left that behind. That too will get a little slimy once it gets cold out. But the new growth from the hostas, as is true for all perennials, your new growth is going to come from the ground up. None of the new growth on perennials comes from any of this old stuff that I'm cutting off. So I think that might be a little fun fact that some of you may not be aware of. So here's a situation where I'm going to tell you not to trim. So here we have some alstroemeria. These alstroemeria are actually annuals here in Michigan, but for the last 3 years, these annuals have come back in the garden. They're a zone 7 or 8, depending on if it's the red or the purple one. So what I'm going to do with these particular plants is I'm going to leave them. I'm not going to trim them, because essentially if I leave this foliage, it's going to help protect them and just give them a little bit of that winter, I don't know, winter coverage that will help protect the base of the plant. Now that would be true of if you have any perennials or annuals that act as perennials that you're like, I don't know, they seem like they're a little tender. I'm not so sure if they're going to overwinter or not. In those situations, then I would tell you, leave the canopy, leave the foliage, because that will add just a little extra protection that may help take them through the winter. Here we have some salvia in the garden. Now, if it was May, June, July, what I would have you do as far as trimming these salvia is I would have you just remove these spent blooms. So just kind of trimming there below. And you can see there's a little snip right there. The gardeners came through earlier this season and removed the spent blooms. And this is all new growth and all new blooms that came later on in the season. So that's what you do mid-season, is just trim just below the blooms. And that will encourage this plant to send up more flowers or rebloom later on in the season. But now that it's October, I'm not anticipating any more rebloom coming from these plants. We're going to do a little bit of a different trim on them. So now, because we're doing our fall trim, we're going to be more aggressive. We're going to take these closer down to the ground. So let me go in here and find, and this is probably several plants. So actually, look at here. So let me pull some of this away. You can see here, these dead twigs here. This is all where this plant was trimmed back last season. So last season when we came through, that's how far we trimmed it back. And we're going to do the same again this year. We're going to just go in there and trim it way back. There's one plant that's been trimmed back. So there's a few of them planted in here. So I'm going to go ahead and get them all trimmed back. There we go. So there you can see just how far back we're giving them a trim. And I'm going to go ahead and actually take care of all of them. There we go. A few more. There we go. So that is how we trim up the salvia. I'm sure a lot of you have irises in your garden, and if you haven't started to trim them back yet, let's take a look. This is going to be another one of those that I'm going to do about 2 to 3 inches tall. And this is another one, when it gets cold and hit by frost, they get kind of slimy and disgusting. So I'm going to go ahead and trim it back now. One thing we may find though, because I am trimming while it's still a little bit warm, some of these plants may push out some new growth, which basically when you trim a plant, that's what you're doing, is you're telling it, hey, I got trimmed, I need to grow some more. So we may see that the plant does put on more growth, but I think that it'll be fine even if it does put on a little bit of growth to go through the winter and not need to be trimmed again. So let's go ahead and get this iris trimmed. All right, So we're gonna reach in here and 2 to 3 inches. There we go. Iris is trimmed. Even though the Coreopsis is still just trying so hard to put on more blooms, and to be honest, it's doing a pretty good job. There's a lot of just little blooms here and there, but the majority of this plant is pretty dried out and just really kind of crispy and crunchy looking. So we're gonna go ahead and trim back this Coreopsis to about 2 to 3 inches and trim this. All right, there we go. So I took it down to about 3 inches or so, and that should be good. So these other two here, we'll go ahead and trim them back as well to about 2 inches, and that way they're nice and cleaned up, trimmed up, ready for winter. And the last plant we're going to trim today is my hardy hibiscus, or my rose mallow. Now this one, there definitely is a lot of opinions on when this should and shouldn't be trimmed. Remember earlier I said I trim things when I have time, and that's the fall. I have always trimmed my rose mallow here in zone 6 for as long as we've had them. Some people will tell you that this is a plant you should trim in the spring. So again, when you have time, when it works best in your schedule is when you can trim it. For me, it's fall, and mine have always overwintered well. The reason why some people will tell you not to trim this in the fall is because it has a hollow stem to it. So if frost or rain gets in that stem, gets into the plant, it could potentially kill the plant. I've never experienced that. Anyone that I've personally know that has trimmed it in the fall, they too all have had success with doing so. But I do have to put a disclaimer. That is the reason why some people will tell you not to trim in the fall, is because moisture can set into those stems and potentially have an effect on your plant. Maybe if your plant is a young plant, only been in the ground for a year, maybe 2, maybe go ahead and trim it in the spring. But for me, we're going to go ahead and trim this plant now. This is a young plant. There's only about 5 or so stems on it, so it's only been in the ground for 1 good full season. It was planted last year, came through last winter, so now we're trimming it again to go into next year. For me, this is when it works best to trim those hardy hibiscus, and that's how it's done. If in the spring, like I mentioned, if you have your plant still in the spring, all of these dead twigs, trim them down right to the ground because nothing is going to come back. Also, another thing with hardy hibiscus, it's going to be one of the last things to emerge in your garden next spring, next summer. Typically here in Michigan, if it's a slow to come spring, it might be June 1st before I start to see any new growth emerge from these plants. So be patient with them. Once they do start to show signs of emerging, they grow quickly. Usually within about 8 weeks, they go from coming up through the ground to those beautiful big dinner plate blooms. If you have any questions or comments on any of the trimming we've done today, or you have plants in your garden that you're curious how they should be trimmed, leave them in the comments below. We'll try to get you an answer. Maybe we'll even go out and do a video on the plants that you're asking about, and we will show you how yours should be trimmed. Thanks for watching. I'm Heidi from Garden Crossings.